What are you pretending not to know? Or, more specifically, what are you pretending not to know about yourself? So we're going to use the analogy of the tailor to explore this question today. And this idea was very much prompted by this lovely little analogy that I found in this essay collection, The Truth About the Truth. So I'm going to expand on it here and make it more relevant for shadow work and inner work more generally. And it's helped me to think about just how fair my picture of the world is, as well as this picture of myself and this idea of fairness, especially. And that's going to be particularly important, as we will see shortly. So, the analogy of the tailor. Let's say that you ask a tailor to restore a dress based on a small sample of cloth that you were able to give him. It's a dress that was important to someone in your family, but over time, it's just been destroyed. So you've only got a few fragments of it left. He doesn't know what the full, complete dress looks like, and you never really knew either. You've got a vague idea, but you don't really know the full picture. You've just got 5 pieces of this dress left. So the question is, how do you decide which is going to be a fair sample to give him to restore this dress? So let's say that there are 5 options. I'll lay all these out first of all, just to make it all nice and clear. Hopefully that should be a bit more obvious on there as well. Just sort out that camera. And that's all fine. Perfect. So let's say these are the 5 options. They all look very, very similar, and they can all be considered fair samples, but some are going to be more fair than others. And this is important, because if we don't have a complete picture to move towards, all we can do is compare them to each other. It has to be a relative comparison, because it's the best that we can do. So one by one, we can start removing some of these samples because they only contain some elements of the final pattern, not all of them. So if we hold on to some of these less fair examples too closely, then all that's going to happen is we're going to get a very misleading and inaccurate picture of what the dress should look like. So a fair sample needs to contain the basic pattern in itself, otherwise the end product, so in this case the dress, is going to go further and further away from what it is that it's trying to actually represent. And if the dress ends up looking like nothing than we expected, then we shouldn't turn the situation back on ourselves and blame ourselves. But similarly, we shouldn't be blaming the tailor because he was just doing the best that he could with what he had available. What we need to do is to take a close look at the fabric samples and honestly and objectively report what it is that we are seeing. So a larger fragment isn't necessarily better than a smaller one. It's a question of how representative it is. So let's return to our question that we're trying to grapple with. What are you pretending not to know about yourself? Well, if we're trying to get a fair representation of who we are, we need to think about the samples that we're choosing to focus on and which ones we are discarding. So the fairest sample of the dress is the one that contains the most elements of the basic pattern of the whole dress. The fairest sample of our lives will similarly be the one that contains the most elements of the basic patterns of our whole lives. So that's going to include our strengths and our difficulties and our upbringing and how we view it, and our ambitions for the future and the access we have to all the spectrum of our feelings. It could be our inbuilt capacities and our tendencies. It might include our natural inclinations towards one thing over another. Literally and metaphorically, some fabric samples of the dress are more accurate than others, and how we perceive the fabric of life is going to be no different either. So to quote the book on page 185, and I'll put the quote on the board, on the screen as well. Sorry, that's my old teacher mindset coming through there. The versions of the world that strike us as being fair or right are those that seem to capture significant aspects of our own experience, perceptions, attitudes, and intuitions. And here's a key point, just to really focus on this and just to really, really highlight it as well. Even if we don't like one element of the pattern of the dress, if we're trying to fairly recreate the dress, it still needs to be included. Even if we find some elements or aspects of our life difficult, if we're trying to truly and fairly understand ourselves, then they need to be included as well. So where the tailor needed the technical skill to fairly recreate the dress, what we need instead is the right attitude and the right courage towards these patterns. And the beauty of the tailor is that he was objective. Whether he liked the dress or not was completely irrelevant. His task was to make a fair representation of the full dress, not to judge whether it was beautiful or not. So we need this exact same mindset when we look at our lives. How can we take a step back and look at ourselves from this wider perspective? How can we take a more objective approach to the question? That's what's going to lead to a more fair representation of where we actually find ourselves. And the bigger task is, with as little judgment as possible, and with as much piercing insight as we can manage, that's why we need to ask ourselves that original question. What am I pretending not to know about myself? And quite often, we instinctively know exactly what it is that we're pretending not to know. We tell ourselves that life is easier if we just don't acknowledge this or that. Or we pretend that this is the case instead of something else. What we're really avoiding there is just taking the responsibility for something that we know that we could manage or that we just don't want to deal with. So ultimately, this is going to be a question of courage and self-honesty. And equally, on a practical level, it's also looking at our current circumstances and seeing what internal and external resources we actually have at hand to deal with some of these things that we're pretending not to know about ourselves. So, just to make this really, really clear, don't be unfairly harsh on yourself, but you do need to be fair and honest with yourself. So, let's make all of this practical with the least amount of pain possible. So let's say there are 3 levels to things that we are pretending not to know. Level 1 can represent the simple and the basic things. So these are the little annoyances that don't really hold all that much weight, but we just prefer to pretend that they weren't there. So these can be little and inconsequential things in the long run. And just calling myself out right now as I'm saying all this, I've got a pile of dishes downstairs that I haven't cleaned up. There's clothes on my bed that need to be put away. And there's a spreadsheet that I need to fill out with some numbers. I just know it's going to be a boring job. In fact, already that I'm catching myself starting to judge these things. But I know that they're going to be easy to fix. I just need to do them and stop pretending like they'll fix themselves. But we can go one step beyond that. So let's put this down as level 2. So these are going to be the patterns and the habits that I could really do with changing, or at least fairly looking at, because they might have a bigger impact in the long run. So looking at my screen time, for example, on any particular day, it's not going to be that bad. But if I repeatedly stack up these hours every single day for weeks and months on end, then what am I missing out on? What am I pretending isn't a problem when actually, if it's repeated long enough, is going to reveal itself to be a bigger problem than I first realized? That's essentially the question for this level. And without me giving more examples here, I'm just going to move on to level 3 because it's going to be a bit easier just to fill in the gaps in between with things like this. So this is going to be the more severe end of pretending. So this isn't so much pretending anymore as it is just outright refusing to see at all. So it's going to be much heavier. It's more like self-betrayal and lying to myself, practically gaslighting myself at times. So what are the more fundamental things that I'm not addressing in my life, and where am I burying my head in the sand instead of dealing with them? That's the question to ask for level 3. And if we return to that tailor analogy from before, whether the tailor actually liked the dress that he was recreating or not, that was completely irrelevant. His subjective view and his perception and his judgment, that all needed to be put to one side to do the job that he was tasked with. It can help here to have the exact same mindset. There might be perceptions that this is too difficult, or there might be judgments that this is unfair, or whatever else it might be. You've just got to try to put these things to one side and put on that objective hat to see what it is that we are actually dealing with. If having a looser approach to levels 1, 2, and 3 helps you to face these things, then by all means think about it that way. Or you could just take a sheet of paper and instead list all of your strengths and difficulties and your current living conditions and your upbringing environment and your plans for the future and so on. I can't remember exactly what I mentioned earlier on, so I'll just put a list on the screen to help it make it a little bit clearer. But essentially, you want to try to get an objective view on the relevant facts so that you can start spotting these patterns. And similarly, if you don't want to make this about yourself, you could think about it in terms of another person or a future plan or an injustice or the state of the world at any given point. In any case, what am I pretending not to know? It's just such a simple and a cutting and a to the point question. And like I said, all of this, like from the very, very beginning, this was prompted by just one little paragraph on page 185 in this book. It's literally just here. These are the samples that I've recreated for the sake of this. Technically speaking, I suppose, it's not so much of a book as it is a series of essays looking at postmodernism and how we've come to view and understand what the word truth even means or represents anymore, if anything. And as with any essay collection, I loved some essays in this, and I didn't think that much of others. But I thought that analogy of the tailor, at the very least, was worth expanding on for shadow work and for inner work exploration, just a bit more generally. So I know it's not a perfect analogy, but I hope intuitively your mind went in one direction over another. And that's basically the whole point to this. So what we're trying to think about is wherever your mind has gone, maybe that's the next meaningful task for you to look at. I've already called myself out on this. I need to go do some washing up and sort out that spreadsheet. So that right now, that's how I'm going to stop pretending. And I know it's a really boring and a really mundane example, but life isn't just about stacking up all the exciting parts. Sometimes it is a bit more mundane. All right, with that in mind, I will see you in a future lesson. See you then.